This is the Casio PT-80, a toy keyboard from the 80s. This one was filthy and kinda broken, and I found it at a Goodwill for $5. The battery cover was missing, so was the ROM pack cover, and it was marked up all over and kinda gross inside and out. But don't worry, I cleaned it up. See? It's nice now. Rubbing alcohol and cotton swabs can work wonders. So now I had a decently working keyboard, but to be honest, it's not the most interesting on its own. The drums are dull and tame, the accompaniment really limited, there's only 8 preset melody sounds to use. I have several other instruments that do more interesting things, but what if I modded it? Now I should probably say first off, I am not an expert on any of this. I've never circuit bent anything before. I can build PCs, one time I swapped out pickups on a guitar, never anything like this. So I thought this Casio might be a good contender to try to circuit bend, since it was already in rough shape, and if I bricked it, hey, I'm out $5. Granted, I bought a ton of extra stuff for the project, but whatever. I could barely find any info on this keyboard, let alone how to go about modding it, so I decided to share this whole process for those that are interested in starting something like this. Like I said, I've had no previous electronics or modding experience, just a tiny bit of soldering experience. I looked up what I could online and just messed around carefully until stuff worked nice. Before I get into it, here's some general circuit bending tips. Never ever mess around with the circuit board while it's plugged into an outlet. Batteries only. Document your process as best you can. Grab a notebook, take pictures, anything. I printed out a pic of the main board so I could write down bend points and label stuff, which helped a ton. Keep track of any screws and other small bits as you take the keyboard apart. You don't want to lose any or try to use the wrong screw putting it all back together. Here's a list of tools and parts that you will likely need. Soldering iron and solder. Mine is a cheap, crappy relic of the past from Radio Shack that I used once, like 10 years ago, to replace pickups in my Telecaster. I'd recommend getting one with one of those springy cradles, because mine fell off its tiny stand way too often. Test leads with alligator clips. Wire, like a lot. Around 20 gauge, stranded, pre-tinned if possible. Get a lot more than you think you will need. Heat shrink tubing. Optional, but very nice if you need to extend or reconnect wires. My wire kit came with a bunch and they came in really handy. Wire cutters or strippers, just obvious. Desoldering braid or wick, also optional, but if you're a crappy solderer like me, it comes in really handy. Toggle switches, SPDT or single pole double throw, both on-on, two-way, and on-off-on. Momentary switches or buttons, normal closed and normal open. Potentiometers, 100K mostly, 1 million for pitch, get a few different resistances. Knobs for your pots. Zip ties, Velcro ties, twist ties, electrical tape, etc. Jeweler's screwdrivers or something skinny and metal for easier bend testing. You'll also benefit from some needle nose pliers or tweezers or tiny flatheads. If your keyboard doesn't have a line out like mine does, you're going to need to get an audio jack, either 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch. Also optional, a hot glue gun. Jerry's still out on that. I talk about that later. Finally, something for cutting, a drill, saw, rotary tool. Alright, so it's bending time. First, you want to carefully unscrew the case and take everything apart so you can get to the circuit board. Ideally, you also want access to the keys and buttons so you can play and stop sounds easily. Now, I didn't do this first, so forgive the continuity errors, but you should really create a reset switch right off the bat. Look for the main battery wire. It should be pretty easy to spot. What you want to do is cut one side of the wire, strip both ends, and slap a switch on there. Why? Because this way you can cut the battery power whenever you want. Sometimes the circuitry will mess up and stuff won't work properly, and the alternative is messing with the main power switch or taking a battery out and putting it back in. Not fun. So put a switch here and it just makes life a lot easier. This is where you really want to use a normal closed momentary button, meaning when you're not touching it, the circuit is closed, the batteries work, and the power stays on. When you tap the button, it interrupts the circuit and resets the machine. See what I'm doing here? This is me realizing all the momentary switches I bought were normal open, and they're not gonna work. I have to hold the button down to keep the keyboard on. So I had to settle for a toggle switch instead. I didn't end up using any of the momentary switches I bought, so whoops, maybe next time. Once you've got your panic button installed, you can actually start looking for cool ways to jank up your sound. Play something repeating on the keyboard like a drum beat and accompaniment, or lay something heavy on a key, or if you've got a demo mode or this super cheesy ROM pack like on this Casio, you can play the same 4 songs over and over until you start hearing them in your dreams. With music of some kind playing, start poking around on the circuit board. You can do this a few different ways. I started by using the alligator clip test leads to create a short circuit between 2 random points. Eventually I realized it's way easier to use these slim screwdrivers to poke around. If yours are fully metal, you should be able to complete the circuit just by holding them. Mine have plastic handles, so I had to make sure I was touching the metal bits or had a test lead clipped to each one to connect them.
Whoa.
You can also just run your finger across the board and look for places that cause distortion. Your body is a natural resistor, or conductor, or whatever the correct term is, and pressing harder or softer can create different sounds. A lot of circuit bending articles and vids I saw recommend installing a body contact on the case exterior for just this purpose. I didn't in this instance, but if you want to, go for it. There are a ton of potential bend spots on this board. I had to just stop looking after a time because A, I had more than enough, and B, it's near impossible to try every single combination. You would go crazy. When you find a combination that sounds cool, write it down, like immediately. After a while, each area will look the same, and if you look away for a second, you'll lose your place. I started to notice patterns after a bit, like certain areas pertaining to certain instruments. That helped cut down on randomly poking around. I had seen a few mods of this particular keyboard, so I had some specific bends in mind to find, but the rest was pretty much random. I guess it depends on how you intend to use the thing when you're done, like, do you just want weird glitchy noises? Do you want more synth-like options available? Do you want a bunch of crazy distortions and overdrives? It also depends on the board and what's available or possible, but in this keyboard's case, there was a lot to come by. One common and useful bend to search for with any project is a timing or pitch bend. Pretty much all sound-producing boards have this as a way to play things back at the proper speed and the correct tuning, and that can be accessed and modified. Once I found a pitch-altering bend, I connected a 1 million ohm potentiometer to it. I'd read online somewhere that 1 million is what you go for with pitch bends. I'm not sure why exactly, but when I hooked up the 100K pot, the pitch and speed range wasn't as wide. Speaking of pots, some bends you find you'll want more options than just on and off. This can be distortion, overdrive, hi-hat decay, whatever sound you want, a range of options instead of 2. That's really up to you. You can also combine switches with pots to dial in a sound and then toggle it on and off. After a whole lot of poking and prodding, I decided I had located all the mods I wanted, and also probably more than can realistically fit on this tiny case. At the end of it, I had a master pitch / speed knob, 5 individual mutes for kick / conga, snare, closed hi-hat, open hi-hat, and accompaniment, boosts for all drums, snare, hats, and 2 different types for accompaniment, kick / conga overdrive, 2 melody distortions, labeled voice presence to be fancy, master distortion, and master feedback / overdrive. A lot of these are subjectively named as mutes excluded. These are all forms of distortion, but whatever. It's time to make these mods permanent with some soldering. If you've never soldered before, it is tricky. I'm not very good at it. You probably shouldn't copy what I'm doing. Maybe look up some soldering tutorials. Whatever the case, always wear safety glasses, because solder can sputter and send tiny molten balls of metal every which way. I'd also recommend getting some of those helping hands, clippy things. It's like a stationary set of alligator clips that you can bend and pose, because you have to hold 3 or 4 things at once and it gets really difficult to hold everything in place. I didn't have the helping hands, so I ended up hanging my alligator clip leads from my camera mount sometimes to hold a component or wire in place. And it sort of helped, but was also just kind of dumb. Keep a damp sponge and or steel wool nearby and wipe the solder or oxidation off your iron every time you use it. It apparently helps with heat transference. Also try to minimize the time you hold the iron to a component or the circuit board because it can do some damage over time. The mini toggle switches I bought melted really fast if I heated them for too long. I also ended up getting potentiometers with 3 different solder points by accident. I would recommend getting ones with little hoops instead of just flat metal bits because it's way easier to wrap the wire around before applying solder. Also, have a fan going or do this outside. The fumes from the flux burning are really irritating. If you use lead-free solder, I don't think it can cause damage, but it still made my throat really sore. So this here turned into a bit of a mess. I started by soldering all the switches and pots to the bend points on the board, and then later when I tried cramming them all into one section, I had a hell of a time untangling wires and not having long enough wires, and it was just a big pain. This way I was able to test each mod one at a time, but you will see later, I ended up redoing everything. I also ran out of wire really early on and started stripping any spare cables I had lying around. I wouldn't recommend it. I was just being lazy and impatient. I had to order more wire and wait for it to get here, but in the end it was way better than using a bunch of assorted gauge wires. After I finally got all the bend points soldered, I went and hot glued all the solder points. I saw someone else do it for their circuit bend project and it seemed like a good idea. In theory, it keeps each solder point isolated and stuck on there really nice. In practice, it didn't stick very well, some wires got pulled out from underneath, and I had to peel it all off later when I resoldered everything again. So your mileage may vary, not sure I'd recommend it. Now to really enhance the look of this overall mod, instead of just mounting each switch to the case, I had a custom panel made. To do this, just be married to a skilled artist with a laser cutter and design knowledge. Super simple. The test panels were matte board, so I could make sure all the holes were in the right place and everything looked okay. The final panel is solid walnut and looks super sleek, in my humble and heavily biased opinion. Once I had everything fit okay on the panel, it was time to cut into the keyboard. I removed the speaker and totally hollowed out that space to make room for everything. First I drilled 5 holes on top for the mute switches, then tried drilling holes into the speaker grill before realizing I should probably just cut the whole thing out. This is where a rotary tool really makes things easy. I went through a few different versions of the panel and several sessions carving out more space until I could get everything to fit properly. But then I found a new problem. While poking around and looking for cool bends, I was using the cheapo speaker that came with the keyboard. After I removed the speaker, I was using headphones to make sure everything still worked okay, and it was not okay. There was distortion and a ton of ambient hiss even when no mods were on and nothing was playing. So somewhere along the line, I either created an unintentional short or I was just using the wrong points to begin with. This is why I had to redo the wiring and sort of start from scratch. Peeled off all the hot glue and unsoldered everything from the board. One by one, I went through each bend point and listened for any added noise when making a connection. There were several bends that added just a tiny bit of noise, even without engaging the circuit, and it all built up into kind of a mess. I wanted to distort the sounds, sure, but I still needed as clean a signal as I could get for recording purposes. When I found a noisy bend, I had to look around for another combination that got me the same or similar effects without adding noise. Fortunately, I was able to find quieter connections for all of the offending circuits, so I got to work resoldering everything. As frustratingly tedious as this was, it had the added benefit of rewiring each connection in a cleaner layout. Having everything installed on the panel first, I could see more clearly how much length I'd need for each wire, how to run them around and behind the board, and I could solder points systematically and not have a zillion wires in the way. After all that, it was just a matter of tucking the wires away where I could and putting the case back together. And by some miracle, it all still worked properly. Here it is, all finished. So, what did we learn? Overall, this turned out really great. I expected it to be slow and frustrating and to hit some roadblocks along the way, but I think for my first time modding something, this could have gone way worse. I gained a better understanding of how circuitry works, I marginally improved my soldering skill, and the end result doesn't look half bad. I could have saved myself some struggle if I'd gotten the right tools earlier on, like enough wire and those helping hands things, and I wasn't able to find all of the potential bend points, as I've seen some people find hi-hat decay, a broader pitch range, and some more varied distortions. I also probably did some minor damage to the board itself, but I can't really tell. I do know that when all my mods are off, the keyboard still sounds somewhat distorted, mainly the cymbals, so at some point I must have changed something unintentionally. But if I ever get ambitious or masochistic enough, I suppose I could dive back in and make some changes. For now, I just want to mess with it. Thanks for watching.